You know that feeling when someone tells you your idea is completely insane, and then later admits you were absolutely right? Well, imagine that happening during the most brutal war in human history, with thousands of lives hanging in the balance. Picture this. It's 1942. Winston Churchill, the man who stared down Hitler himself, is sitting in a war room looking at a plan presented by Canadian military officers. And his reaction? He calls it suicide. Pure madness. A waste of good men. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. Less than a year later, that same Winston Churchill would call this operation one of the most brilliant tactical decisions of the entire Second World War. What changed his mind? What did the Canadians see that the greatest military mind in Britain completely missed? And why does this story matter so much that it's still taught in military academies around the world today? Before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. Because if you love real history that reads like a thriller, you're in exactly the right place. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever had someone doubt your idea only to prove them spectacularly wrong later? I want to hear your stories. Now, let's rewind to understand why Churchill's reaction was so visceral, and why the Canadians were willing to risk everything on a plan that looked like certain death on paper. The year is 1942, and let me paint you a picture of just how desperate things were for the Allies. France had fallen. Most of Europe was under Nazi control. Britain had survived the Blitz, but barely. The Soviet Union was locked in a death struggle on the Eastern Front, bleeding men by the hundreds of thousands. And across the Atlantic, America had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor, but they were still ramping up their war machine. Here's what most people don't understand about this moment in history. The Allies were losing. Not just struggling, actually losing. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than they could be built. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. And perhaps most terrifying of all, there was a very real possibility that Stalin might negotiate a separate peace with Hitler if the Western Allies didn't open a second front soon. Think about that pressure for a moment. Churchill wasn't just fighting a war, he was fighting time itself. Every day that passed without a second front meant more Soviet soldiers dying, more pressure on Stalin to cut a deal, and more time for Hitler to consolidate his grip on Europe. But here's the problem. The Allies weren't ready for a full invasion of Europe. Not even close. They didn't have enough landing craft. They didn't have enough trained troops. They didn't have enough experience in amphibious operations. Trying to invade France in 1942 would have been a catastrophe that might have cost the Allies the entire war. So what do you do when you're trapped between impossible choices? When doing nothing means losing, but doing something might mean losing even faster. This is where the Canadians enter our story, and trust me, you need to understand who these men were to appreciate the audacity of what they were about to propose. The Canadian military in 1942 was in a unique and frankly frustrating position. They had been in Britain since 1939, training, preparing, waiting. Thousands of young Canadian men had crossed the Atlantic ready to fight, ready to prove themselves, ready to make a difference. And what had they been doing? Sitting, waiting, training some more. Can you imagine that frustration? You've left your home, your family, your entire life behind to fight against genuine evil, and month after month you're just waiting, running drills, doing exercises. While across the channel, people are suffering under Nazi occupation. But here's what made the Canadian forces special. They weren't just sitting around getting soft. They were training harder than almost any other Allied unit. They were innovating. They were studying every scrap of intelligence about German coastal defenses. They were practicing amphibious landings until they could do them in their sleep. And most importantly, they were developing a chip on their shoulder, a burning need to prove that Canadians could fight with the best of them. Now, let me introduce you to some of the key players in this drama, because understanding their personalities is crucial to understanding why this plan came together the way it did. First, there's Major General John Hamilton Roberts, the commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Roberts was a professional soldier, methodical and careful, but also deeply aware of the morale problems festering in his command. He knew his men needed action, but he also knew that action without purpose was just slaughter. Then you have Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations. This guy was Churchill's golden boy, charismatic, bold, maybe a little too confident. Mountbatten had been tasked with planning raids on occupied Europe, probing for weaknesses, learning lessons that would be crucial for the eventual invasion. He was under enormous pressure to show results, to prove that the Allies could strike back at Hitler's fortress Europe. And hovering over all of them was Churchill himself, brilliant, mercurial, prone to both flashes of genius and catastrophic misjudgments. A man who understood that wars are won not just on battlefields but in the court of public opinion, in the morale of soldiers and civilians alike. These three men, along with their staffs, were about to collide over a plan that would become one of the most controversial operations of the entire war. So what was this plan that Churchill initially called suicide? Let me break it down for you, and I want you to really think about this from the perspective of the men who would have to execute it. The target was a French port town called Dieppe. Now, Dieppe wasn't some backwater fishing village, it was a heavily fortified position on the coast of northern France, bristled with German defenses. We're talking artillery positions on the cliffs overlooking the beaches, machine gun nests covering every approach, barbed wire, concrete bunkers. The Germans had spent 2 years turning this place into a fortress. And the Canadian plan? A frontal assault across open beaches in broad daylight. Yeah, you heard that right. No nighttime cover. No extended naval bombardment to soften up the defenses. No airborne drops behind enemy lines to take out the coastal guns. Just a straight-up amphibious assault against a fortified position. When Churchill first heard this plan, his reaction was immediate and visceral. This is suicide. You're going to get those men killed for nothing. And you know what? Looking at it on paper, Churchill had every reason to think that. Every military lesson from history screamed that this was a terrible idea. You don't attack fortified positions from the sea without overwhelming firepower. You don't assault defended beaches in daylight without air superiority and naval support. You don't send men across open ground into the teeth of prepared defenses unless you absolutely have no other choice. So here's the question that probably has you on the edge of your seat. Why did the Canadians think this could work? What did they know that Churchill didn't? Let me ask you something before we continue. Do you think you could convince Churchill, Winston Churchill, that he was wrong about military strategy? Drop a comment and tell me how you'd argue your case to one of history's greatest leaders. The answer to why the Canadians believed in this plan isn't simple, and honestly, it's still debated by historians to this day. But let me walk you through their thinking because it's actually more sophisticated than it first appears. First, understand that this wasn't conceived as a traditional military operation meant to hold ground. The plan, codenamed Operation Jubilee, was designed as a large-scale raid. Get in, accomplish specific objectives, get out. The goals were multiple: test new equipment and tactics for amphibious landings, gather intelligence on German defenses, destroy key installations, capture German prisoners and code materials, and perhaps most importantly, prove to Stalin that the Western Allies were serious about opening a second front. The Canadians argued that a raid on this scale would force the Germans to divert resources to coastal defense, taking pressure off other fronts. It would provide invaluable lessons for the eventual invasion of Europe. And it would boost morale, both for the Allied forces who desperately needed a victory, and for the occupied populations of Europe who needed hope. But here's the part that's often left out of the history books. There was also political pressure. The Canadian government wanted their forces in action. The public back home was asking why Canadian boys were sitting in England while others were fighting and dying. There was a sense that Canada needed to prove itself as a major contributor to the Allied war effort, not just Britain's junior partner. So when Mountbatten presented a version of this plan to Churchill, it came wrapped in all these strategic justifications. And slowly, reluctantly, Churchill began to come around. Not because he suddenly thought it was a brilliant idea, but because he understood the political and strategic necessity of doing something, even if that something was risky. But Churchill's approval came with reservations. He wanted assurances. He wanted backup plans. He wanted to know that if things went wrong, the forces could be withdrawn quickly. And most importantly, he wanted to be convinced that the intelligence justified the risk. This is where the story gets really interesting because what happened next would change Churchill's mind from reluctant approval to enthusiastic support. But not in the way you might think. Let me tell you about the intelligence that the Canadians had gathered, because this is where their confidence really came from. Through a combination of reconnaissance photos, French resistance reports, and signals intelligence, the Canadian planners believed they had identified weaknesses in the German defenses at Dieppe. They thought they knew the German patrol schedules. They believed certain gun emplacements could be neutralized quickly. They had identified what they thought were gaps in the defensive coverage. Most crucially, they believed they could achieve tactical surprise despite the daylight assault, because the Germans wouldn't expect such a bold, frontal attack. Here's the thing about military intelligence in World War II. It was an art, not a science. You had grainy photos taken from high altitude. You had reports from brave French civilians who risked their lives to get information to the Allies. You had German radio communications that you could intercept but might not fully understand. And from all this fragmentary, incomplete information, You had to construct a picture of enemy defenses and make life-or-death decisions. The Canadians looked at this intelligence and saw opportunity. Churchill looked at the same intelligence and saw risk. Who was right? Well, that's what makes this story so compelling. As the planning progressed through the spring of 1942, something interesting started happening. Churchill's attitude began to shift. Not dramatically at first, but you could see it in the meeting notes, in the correspondence, in the way he talked about the operation. The man who had called it suicide was starting to see the potential. What changed? Was it the intelligence reports? Was it pressure from Stalin for the Second Front? Was it the persuasive arguments from Mountbatten and the Canadian commanders? Or was it something else entirely? I think it was a combination of all these factors, plus something that's harder to quantify: Churchill's gambler's instinct. The man who had orchestrated the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, a catastrophic failure, had learned hard lessons about the cost of military adventurism. But he had also learned that sometimes, you have to roll the dice. Sometimes, the cautious move is actually the most dangerous move because it hands the initiative to your enemy. Churchill began to see Operation Jubilee not as a suicide mission, but as a necessary experiment. A test run for the real invasion that would have to come eventually. Better to learn the hard lessons now, with a limited force, than to discover the problems during the actual invasion of Europe when millions of lives would be at stake. But here's the uncomfortable truth that I need you to understand. Churchill's growing support for the operation wasn't based on suddenly believing it would be a military success. It was based on believing that the lessons learned would be worth the cost, even if that cost was high. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to approve an operation knowing that men will die, but believing that their sacrifice will save even more lives later. It's the kind of calculation that kept Churchill awake at night, that aged him visibly during the war years, that haunted him for the rest of his life. So by early August 1942, Operation Jubilee was approved and ready to go. The Canadian 2nd Division, along with British commandos and a small American Ranger unit, would assault Dieppe. Over 6,000 men would hit those beaches. And whatever happened, the world was about to learn some very expensive lessons about amphibious warfare. Now, before I tell you what happened during the actual raid, and trust me, this is where the story gets intense, I want you to pause and think about something. If you were one of those Canadian soldiers, knowing that Churchill himself had initially called this plan suicide, how would you feel boarding that landing craft? Would you trust your commanders? Would you believe in the mission? Or would you be thinking that you were being sent to die for politics? Comment below and tell me, would you have volunteered for this mission? Be honest. August 19, 1942. Before dawn, a fleet of over 250 ships approached the coast of France. On board, thousands of young Canadians checked their weapons, adjusted their gear, and tried to control the fear that every soldier feels before going into combat. Many of them had never seen battle before. This would be their first and, for far too many, their last taste of war. The plan called for commando raids on the flanks to take out the coastal batteries, followed by the main assault on the beaches of Dieppe itself. Tanks would land to support the infantry. Engineers would destroy specific targets. The raid would last a few hours, then everyone would withdraw back to England. Simple, right? Here's what actually happened, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this because you need to understand the reality of what these men faced. The operation started going wrong almost immediately. The element of surprise, which the entire plan depended on, was compromised when the landing force ran into a German coastal convoy in the dark. Gunfire erupted, alerting the German defenses that something was coming. On the eastern flank, the British commandos managed to knock out their target battery in a textbook raid. That part worked. But on the western flank, the assault failed, leaving those guns operational and able to rain fire down on the main beaches. And then came the main assault on Dieppe itself, and this is where everything fell apart in the most horrific way possible. Picture this: landing craft approaching beaches in daylight. The ramps drop. Canadian soldiers pour out into waist-deep water. And immediately, they're hit by a wall of machine gun fire from the cliffs above. Germans in prepared positions with clear fields of fire, cutting down men as they tried to cross the beach. The noise must have been deafening. Machine guns, artillery, men shouting, screaming, dying. The water turning red with blood. Bodies floating in the surf. And still, the Canadians pushed forward because that's what soldiers do. They follow orders even when everything is falling apart around them. Some men made it across the beach to the seawall. A few even made it into the town. But without support, without covering fire, without any way to suppress the German defenses, they were cut off and surrounded. The tanks that were supposed to provide mobile firepower? Most of them got stuck on the rocky beach or were destroyed by German anti-tank guns. The raid that was supposed to last a few hours became a desperate struggle for survival. Men trapped on the beach, pinned down by fire from above, watching their friends die around them. Officers trying to organize withdrawals under impossible circumstances. Naval commanders offshore watching through binoculars, unable to provide effective support, knowing that every minute that passed meant more casualties. By mid-morning, it was clear that the operation was a catastrophe. The order came to withdraw, but for many men withdrawal was impossible. They were already dead, wounded, or pinned down so completely that getting back to the landing craft was suicide. When the boats finally pulled away from Dieppe and headed back to England, they left behind over 900 Canadian dead on those beaches. Another 2,000 were captured, many of them wounded. In a single day, in a few hours of combat, the 2nd Canadian Division had been devastated. The statistics are brutal. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who went ashore, fewer than half made it back to England. Some units suffered casualty rates of over 90%. Think about that, 9 out of 10 men killed, wounded, or captured. Back in England, when the survivors staggered off the boats, the scale of the disaster became clear. This wasn't just a failed raid. This was a bloodbath. This was exactly what Churchill had feared when he first called the plan suicide. And here's where most people think the story ends, with Churchill vindicated in his initial assessment, with the Canadians having paid a terrible price for a failed operation, with lessons about the foolishness of attacking fortified positions without adequate support. But that's not where this story ends. Not even close. Because something remarkable happened in the aftermath of Dieppe, something that would completely change Churchill's perspective and the course of the war. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could Churchill possibly call this disaster one of the smartest moves of the war? How could an operation that killed or captured thousands of men be considered anything other than a catastrophic failure? This is where we need to shift our perspective and look at what happened after Dieppe, because this is where the real story begins. In the weeks and months following the raid, Allied military planners conducted exhaustive debriefings with the survivors. Every detail was analyzed, every decision was questioned, every aspect of the operation was picked apart to understand what had gone wrong and, more importantly, what lessons could be learned. And here's where things get interesting. The list of lessons was staggering. They learned that you absolutely cannot assault a defended port without massive preliminary bombardment. The idea of tactical surprise against a fortified position? Forget it. You need overwhelming firepower to suppress the defenses. They learned that tanks need specialized equipment to operate on beaches. The tanks at Dieppe got stuck on the shingle because nobody had tested them on that specific type of terrain. This led directly to the development of specialized armored vehicles for beach operations. The famous Hobart's funnies, that would prove crucial on D-Day. They learned that you need much better communication between naval forces, air support, and ground troops. At Dieppe, coordination was terrible, with units unable to call in support or even report their positions accurately. They learned that air superiority alone isn't enough. You need close air support, aircraft that can directly attack defensive positions in real time, coordinated with ground forces. The RAF flew hundreds of sorties during Dieppe, but most of them were dogfighting German fighters, not supporting the troops on the beach. They learned that attacking a fortified port head-on was suicide, which led to the development of the Mulberry harbors, the artificial ports that would be towed across the channel for the D-Day landings, eliminating the need to capture a port in the initial assault. But here's the most crucial lesson, and this is what Churchill eventually came to understand. They learned that the original D-Day plan would have been a catastrophe. Let me explain this because it's absolutely critical. Before Dieppe, the Allied plan for invading Europe involved a direct assault on a French port, probably Calais or Cherbourg. The thinking was that you needed a port to supply your invasion force, so you had to capture one quickly. Dieppe proved beyond any doubt that this approach would have failed spectacularly. The Germans would have been waiting. The defenses would have been even stronger than at Dieppe. And the Allies would have suffered casualties that might have made the invasion impossible to sustain. After Dieppe, the entire invasion strategy was reconceived. Instead of attacking a port, the Allies would land on open beaches in Normandy, which were less heavily defended. Instead of capturing a port for supply, they would build their own artificial harbors. Instead of relying on surprise and speed, they would use overwhelming force and meticulous planning. Every major decision that made D-Day successful can be traced back to lessons learned at Dieppe. The specialized landing craft and beach clearance equipment. The massive naval bombardment. The airborne operations to secure the flanks. The artificial harbors. The deception plans to fool the Germans about where the landing would occur. All of it came from analyzing what went wrong on those bloody beaches in August 1942. This is what Churchill eventually came to understand, and this is why his opinion shifted so dramatically. Dieppe was a catastrophe, yes. But it was a catastrophe that saved the Allies from an even greater catastrophe 2 years later. Think about it this way. If the lessons of Dieppe had been learned during the actual invasion of Europe, with hundreds of thousands of troops committed instead of just a few thousand, the war might have been lost. D-Day might have failed. The invasion of Europe might have been impossible. Churchill, with his historian's mind and his understanding of the long arc of warfare, came to see Dieppe not as a failure but as a terrible, necessary education. The Canadians who died on those beaches didn't die for nothing. They died teaching lessons that would ultimately save thousands of other lives and win the war. But here's the uncomfortable question that we need to grapple with. Does that calculation make it okay? Does the fact that Dieppe's lessons proved crucial for D-Day justify sending those men into what was, by any objective measure, a doomed operation? Churchill wrestled with this question for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, he's careful in how he discusses Dieppe, acknowledging the sacrifice while emphasizing the lessons learned. But you can read between the lines and sense the guilt, the awareness that he had approved an operation that killed thousands of young men. The Canadian survivors and the families of the dead had their own complex relationship with Dieppe. Some felt that their sacrifice had been vindicated by the success of D-Day. Others felt, quite understandably, that they had been sent on a suicide mission for political reasons and that the military value was invented after the fact to justify the losses. Here's what I find fascinating. Both perspectives can be true. Dieppe can have been both a poorly conceived operation that never should have happened, and a source of crucial lessons that changed the course of the war. History isn't simple, and the biggest events often contain contradictions that we can't easily resolve. Let me give you some specific examples of how Dieppe directly influenced D-Day, because this is where Churchill's transformation from skeptic to supporter becomes undeniable. The naval bombardment at Dieppe was minimal. Planners worried about civilian casualties and thought surprise was more important than firepower. At D-Day, the naval bombardment was massive, with battleships and cruisers pounding German defenses for hours before the landing. That change came directly from Dieppe. At Dieppe, there was no coordinated plan for dealing with beach obstacles. Engineers went ashore with the assault troops and were cut down before they could clear paths. At D-Day, specialized tanks went in first to clear obstacles, followed by engineers with specific equipment designed for the job. That change came from Dieppe. At Dieppe, landing craft dropped men into deep water under direct fire. At D-Day, the landing craft had ramps that could be adjusted based on the tide, and the timing of the landing was carefully calculated to minimize the distance men had to cross under fire. That change came from Dieppe. At Dieppe, there was no effective way to evacuate wounded from the beaches. Men died from wounds that should have been survivable because there was no organized medical evacuation. At D-Day, medical teams landed with the first waves, and evacuation procedures were built into the plan from the start. That change came from Dieppe. I could go on, but you get the point. Every aspect of the D-Day operation was influenced by what happened at Dieppe. The planners for Operation Overlord, the codename for D-Day, studied the Dieppe reports obsessively. They were determined not to repeat those mistakes. And here's the remarkable thing, it worked. D-Day was successful largely because of lessons learned at Dieppe. The casualties on D-Day were much lower than planners expected, precisely because they had figured out how to assault defended beaches effectively. This is what Churchill came to understand, and this is why his opinion shifted so dramatically. In the immediate aftermath, he saw Dieppe as confirmation of his initial fears, a disaster that had cost thousands of lives. But as the lessons were absorbed and the plans for D-Day took shape, he began to see it differently. In meetings during the planning for D-Day, Churchill would reference Dieppe constantly. "We learned at Dieppe that," became a common phrase. He wasn't celebrating the operation, but he was acknowledging its value as a learning experience. And gradually, his language shifted from talking about Dieppe as a tragedy to talking about it as a necessary step on the road to victory. By 1944, when D-Day succeeded beyond anyone's hopes, Churchill's transformation was complete. In conversations with his generals and in his personal correspondence, he began describing the Dieppe Raid as one of the most valuable operations of the war. Not because it succeeded in its immediate objectives, but because it failed in ways that taught the Allies how to succeed later. Now, here's where I want to bring this story full circle and connect it to something larger than just World War II history. Because the story of Dieppe and Churchill's changing perspective teaches us something profound about leadership, about learning from failure, and about how we evaluate decisions in hindsight. Churchill's initial assessment of the Dieppe plan as suicide was correct. His military instincts were sound. The operation was risky to the point of being reckless, and the execution revealed flaws in planning and intelligence that should have been caught earlier. If Churchill had stuck to his guns and refused to approve the operation, those 1,000 Canadians who died at Dieppe would have lived. But would the Allies have learned the lessons they needed to learn? Would D-Day have been planned differently without Dieppe to learn from? Would the invasion of Europe have succeeded, or would it have failed in the same ways that Dieppe failed, but with catastrophic consequences? These are impossible questions to answer with certainty, but they highlight something important. Sometimes the cautious decision, the safe decision, isn't actually the wisest decision. Sometimes you have to take risks, knowing that failure is possible because the alternative is being unprepared when the stakes are even higher. Churchill understood this at a fundamental level. He had learned it at Gallipoli, where his bold plan for a naval attack on Turkey ended in disaster. He had learned it during the darkest days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and every decision was a choice between terrible options. He carried that knowledge with him throughout the war, making calculations that would haunt him but that he believed were necessary. The Canadian soldiers at Dieppe were asked to pay the price for those calculations. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Military leadership often means sending men into danger, knowing that some won't come back, believing that their sacrifice serves a larger purpose. It's a burden that weighs on anyone with a conscience, and Churchill felt that burden acutely. But here's what makes Churchill's transformation on Dieppe so remarkable. He didn't try to spin the disaster as a success. He didn't pretend that everything had gone according to plan. He acknowledged the failure while also recognizing the value that came from it. That kind of honest assessment, that willingness to hold two seemingly contradictory thoughts at the same time, is what separates great leaders from merely competent ones. So when Churchill called Dieppe one of the smartest moves of the war, he wasn't saying it was well executed or that the casualties were acceptable. He was saying that the lessons learned were worth the cost, as terrible as that cost was. He was saying that the operation, despite failing in its immediate objectives, succeeded in a larger strategic sense by ensuring that future operations would be better planned and executed. You might disagree with that assessment. Many people do, and they have valid reasons. The families of the men who died at Dieppe might not find comfort in the idea that their loved ones were learning experiences. The survivors who lived with physical and psychological scars might not appreciate being told that their suffering had value. And that's okay. This isn't a story with a clean moral lesson or a tidy conclusion. It's a story about the messy reality of leadership during war, about the difficulty of learning from mistakes when those mistakes cost lives, about the challenge of evaluating decisions when the full consequences take years to unfold. What I want you to take away from this story is not that Dieppe was good or bad, success or failure, justified or unjustified. What I want you to take away is that history is complicated, that the same event can be both a catastrophe and a blessing depending on your perspective and your time frame, and that sometimes the wisest decisions are the ones that look foolish in the moment but prove their value over time. Churchill's journey from calling the Dieppe plan suicide to calling it one of the smartest moves of the war mirrors our own journey in understanding history. First impressions are often wrong. Initial assessments miss important context. And the true meaning of events often only becomes clear with time and perspective. The Canadians who fought at Dieppe deserve to be remembered not as victims of a foolish plan, but as soldiers who paid a terrible price to teach lessons that helped win the war. Their sacrifice was real, their courage was undeniable, and their contribution to victory was significant, even if it didn't come in the form they expected. Churchill deserves to be remembered not as a leader who callously sent men to their deaths, but as someone who struggled with impossible decisions, learned from mistakes, and ultimately helped guide the Allies to victory. His transformation on Dieppe shows both his initial wisdom in recognizing a flawed plan and his ultimate wisdom in recognizing that value can come from failure. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Dieppe reminds us that learning is often expensive, that mistakes have consequences, but that refusing to learn from those mistakes is even more costly. The Allies learned at Dieppe, and those lessons saved thousands of lives on D-Day. That doesn't erase the tragedy of Dieppe, but it gives it meaning. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this. In your own life, have you ever had an experience that seemed like a failure at the time but taught you lessons that proved invaluable later? Have you ever paid a price for learning something that you couldn't have learned any other way? Drop a comment and share your story, because I think this pattern, failure leading to wisdom, painful lessons enabling future success, is something we all experience, just on a much smaller scale than Churchill and the Canadians at Dieppe. And if you've made it this far in this video, you're clearly someone who appreciates deep dives into historical events, who wants to understand the complexity behind the headlines, who's willing to grapple with uncomfortable questions. That's exactly the kind of viewer I create content for, so hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Before I wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought about Churchill, the Canadians, and the raid on Dieppe. The story we've explored today is ultimately about perspective. How our understanding of events changes as we gain distance and context. How failure and success aren't always as clearly separated as we like to think, and how the meaning of sacrifice evolves over time. Churchill started by seeing a suicide mission. He ended by seeing a strategic victory disguised as a tactical defeat. Both perspectives were valid and both were incomplete. The truth, as usual, was more complex than either simple narrative. The next time you're tempted to judge a decision as obviously right or obviously wrong, remember Churchill and Dieppe. Remember that the people making the decision have information and pressures you might not see, that the consequences of decisions often take years to fully unfold, and that the wisest course of action isn't always the safest one. And remember those Canadian soldiers who went ashore at Dieppe knowing the risks, following orders despite the danger, and paying with their lives to teach lessons that would help win the war. They deserve our respect, our gratitude, and our commitment to understanding their story in all its complexity. Thanks for watching, thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another fascinating story from history. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper than the surface level. That's where the really interesting stuff is hiding. What do you think? Was Churchill right to initially call it suicide? Was he right to later call it brilliant? Or was he wrong both times? Let me know in the comments. And tell me what other World War II stories you want me to cover, because there are so many incredible, complex, messy stories from that era that deserve this kind of analysis. See you next time.